Hello, how are you? It's me, your narrator for Sleepless Nights, ready to dive into yet another monotonous story in the Boring History for Sleep series. Today's theme is how the Vikings survived Greenland's harsh winters. Before you start, turn off the light, snuggle up on your soft pillow, and let the modern world outside. If you like what you hear, give it a like and subscribe, but only if you want to. No pressure. In the comments, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's travel to a place where the cold was as constant as your electricity bill in the winter. Greenland. The name itself is already a bad joke, isn't it? Green Earth. You can imagine the poor Viking, perhaps a little nearsighted, arriving by boat after weeks of seasickness and dried fish-based diets, and looking out over that white-gray expanse, dotted with icebergs the size of floating cathedrals. He must have thought, "Eric, you bastard, you fooled me again." Because let's face it, Greenland wasn't green. It wasn't even a faded moss green. It was a bluish-gray icy white, speckled with bare rocks and occasionally a rickety shrub that seemed to have given up on life centuries ago. Picture the scene. You, a brave, or maybe just desperate, Norse settler, landing on a pebble beach, with the biting wind whipping your face and the smell of salt and ice invading your nostrils. There was no Starbucks in sight, no Uber to take you home. The only thing that awaited you was the promise of a life of hard work, constant cold, and the company of sheep who probably had more sense of direction than you. If these days you complain when Wi-Fi goes down, imagine the disappointment of discovering that your new promised land was actually a giant freezer with no door. The Vikings, those fearless adventurers who plundered and exploited, were also in many ways incredibly naive, or maybe just too optimistic, which, in an environment like Greenland, was almost the same thing as being suicidal. They came in search of new land, of pasture for their cattle, of a fresh start away from the intrigues and overpopulation, yes, overpopulation, even back then, of Norway and Iceland. What they found was an icy invitation to an existence of pure resilience, where each day was a battle against the elements. Think about your home now. Heated, lit, with running water and a full refrigerator. Now imagine yourself in a peat hut, with the wind howling through the cracks, the smell of smoke and sweat permeating the air, and the only source of heat being a fire that threatens to go out at any moment. The reality of Greenland was a thermal and cultural shock. There were no dense forests to cut wood, only gnarled bushes and peat to burn. There was no fertile soil to plant wheat in abundance, just a thin layer of frozen earth that barely supported a few hardy crops. The arrival was not a picnic. It was an act of blind faith, driven by the promise of Eric the Red, a man who, let's face it, had an innate talent for real estate marketing, even if his properties were inhospitable. He called it Greenland, to attract settlers, knowing that a more honest name such as Land of Ice and Despair, where you're likely to die of cold, wouldn't have the same appeal. And so these Vikings, accustomed to plundering villages and sailing seas, found themselves facing a much more implacable enemy. The weather, an enemy that could not be defeated with a battle axe but only endured day after day, winter after winter, until the land itself decided that enough was enough. Greenland wasn't just a place, it was a test, and most of them, unknowingly, had already failed before even disembarking. Eric the Red, a name that echoes through the centuries, not for great feats of bravery in battle, but for one of the greatest real estate marketing moves in history, surpassing even today's most insistent realtors. Imagine the scenario. Eric, a man with a temper as quick as the Icelandic volcano he probably cursed, had been exiled from Iceland. Not once, but twice. The first, for murder. The second, for more murders. Clearly, Eric wasn't the kind of neighbor you'd invite to a Sunday barbecue. He was a walking problem, a magnet for trouble, and Iceland, already a place not given to frills, decided that it had had enough. So what does an exiled Viking do with a history of violence and a boat at his disposal? He will explore, of course, and that's how Eric the Red discovered Greenland. Or, to be more precise, he found her, since she had been there for millions of years, waiting patiently to be named by someone with a peculiar sense of humor. He spent 3 years exploring the southwest coast, probably freezing his toes and dreaming of a decent fireplace. And what did he see? Majestic fjords, yes, but also towering glaciers, rocky mountains, and an amount of ice that would make a penguin feel right at home. But Eric wasn't just a killer. He was a visionary, or a compulsive liar, depending on your point of view. He knew that no one in their right mind would want to move to a place that sounded like land of ice and slow death. So he came up with a brilliant idea, worthy of a modern sales guru. He called it Greenland or Greenland, a masterstroke. Think about it. You're in Iceland, a place that, while it has its charm, is basically a volcanic rock with sheep. Someone offers you the chance to go to the Greenland. Sounds like an upgrade, doesn't it? Almost like exchanging a rusty Beetle for a car that is actually a tractor, but which in the ad looks like a luxury SUV. The naivety of the colonists is almost touching. They were farmers, people who sought land to cultivate and pastures for their animals. Iceland was getting crowded and fertile land was scarce. The promise of a Greenland must have sounded like music to their ears, a pastoral paradise where cattle would fatten and crops would be plentiful. They probably ignored the whispers about Eric's temper, or if they did, thought it was just his way of being direct. After all, who would care about a few deaths if the final destination was prosperity? They boarded their ships probably with their families, their few belongings and the hope of a better life. Small children, the elderly, all huddled together, facing the icy waves of the North Atlantic, with the image of lush meadows and mighty rivers in their minds. The reality, as you may have already imagined, was a thermal and visual shock. Instead of green fields, they found frozen tundra. Instead of forests, rickety bushes. Instead of a mild climate, biting winds that seemed to want to tear the skin off his face. Eric the Red had sold a dream, and they bought it. There were no colorful pamphlets, no 360-degree virtual tours, just the word of a man who, to be fair, was desperate to have company, and perhaps a private army to protect himself from future exiles. And so, thousands of Vikings in several waves of migration settled in Greenland, deluded by the promise of a paradise that was, in fact, an icy purgatory. They were, in essence, the first victims of a large-scale deceptive marketing campaign. And unlike today, where you can complain to Procon or leave a negative review online, the only complaint they could make was to die of cold or hunger. A 1-star review, for sure. Peat houses, the architecture of despair. Ah, the peat houses. If you've ever complained about your small apartment or your house with poor ventilation, get ready for an olfactory and tactile trip to the past. The Vikings in Greenland did not have access to abundant timber. Forget the dense forests of Scandinavia. Here what there were gnarled bushes and, well, peat. A lot of peat. And stones. And so, with these uninspiring materials, they built their homes, which were fewer houses and more human burrows, designed to maintain warmth at any cost, even if that cost was sanity and smell. Imagine building a house out of blocks of dirt and grass. It's not exactly every architect's dream, is it? Peat, basically, is soil rich in decomposed organic matter, cut into blocks. Think of a cake of moist, compacted earth. They stacked these blocks, alternating with layers of stones, to create incredibly thick walls. These walls could be more than 3 feet thick, a formidable barrier against the biting wind and icy cold. The roof was made of driftwood, a precious and scarce resource brought by sea from distant lands, covered by more layers of peat and grass, which acted as a natural insulator. On top of it all, the grass grew, giving the house the appearance of a green hill, almost as if the earth itself had spewed out a habitable structure. But what did this mean for the householder? Well, it meant darkness. The windows were small, if they existed at all, to minimize heat loss. Natural light was a luxury, and most of the lighting came from the central fireplace, which was also used for cooking and heating. The air inside was a dense, heady mixture of peat smoke, which has a peculiar, earthy, slightly sulfurous smell, human sweat, animal odors. Yes, many animals, such as sheep and calves, were sheltered indoors during the winter to protect them from the cold and to harness their body heat, and of course the unmistakable smell of a population that did not have access to daily showers or deodorants. If you think the rush hour subway is an olfactory challenge, imagine living in a peat house for months on end. The engineering was rudimentary but effective. The thickness of the walls and roof created an indoor microclimate, where the temperature was significantly higher than the exterior. But make no mistake, it wasn't a spa. It was a humid, stuffy, and claustrophobic environment. The moisture of the soil and the peat itself, combined with the breathing of humans and animals, created an environment conducive to mold and mildew. The walls could cry damp, and the dirt floor was often muddy. You didn't walk around in socks. Boots were a necessity even indoors. And the stench? Ah, the stench. It was a symphony of organic odors. The smell of smoke permeated everything. Clothes, hair, her own skin. The smell of animals, of their waste, of their damp wool. The smell of food cooking in the fireplace, often a stew of meat and fat that simmered for hours. And of course, the human smell. Think of a sauna that is never clean, where people live, eat, sleep, and yes, relieve themselves, in buckets which were emptied as often as the cold allowed. There was no privacy, there was no personal space. Proximity was a necessity for survival, but also a constant source of discomfort and, for us, olfactory horror. These turf houses were more than just shelters. They were fortresses against ruthless nature. They represented the resilience and ingenuity of the Vikings, but also the brutality of their existence. There was no interior design, only functionality. There was no comfort, only survival. And when you think about your heating bill this winter, remember the Vikings who paid with their comfort, their sense of smell, and perhaps a piece of their soul, to keep warm in their peat burrows. It was the architecture of despair, but it was what kept them alive. And let's face it, it was much more effective than his more expensive down jacket. The diet of desperation, no pizza, only focus. If you're the type to panic when the food delivery app crashes or when the grocery store is out of your favorite flavor of ice cream, get ready for a dose of Viking reality. In Greenland, the idea of diet was not about calories or carbohydrates, but about pure and simple survival. Forget the food pyramid. Theirs was more of a straight line, and on top of it was anything that moved and could be hunted, fished, or gathered before winter froze it to the soul. Greenland wasn't exactly a breadbasket. The soil was poor, the climate unforgiving, and the growing season ridiculously short. This meant that agriculture as we know it was a bad joke. They tried to grow barley and rye, but the harvests were lean and uncertain. There were no golden fields of wheat swaying in the wind, just a few stubborn beds that barely produced enough to feed a hungry squirrel. The idea of freshly baked bread was an unimaginable luxury. What they had was, at best, a thin porridge made from scarce grain, or perhaps a flat, rock-hard loaf if they were lucky. So what was left? The meat. Lots of meat. And fat. More fat. The Viking diet in Greenland was predominantly carnivorous, and the main source of protein came from the sea and frozen land. Seals, whales, fish, reindeer, polar bears, if they were brave or desperate enough, and seabirds were the mainstays of their diet. Imagine your daily dish, not a juicy steak with chips, but a piece of seal meat, perhaps a little rancid, accompanied by whale blubber. Delicious, isn't it? Especially when you've been eating this for months on end, with no spices, no variety, just the brutal need for calories to keep the body functioning. The seal in particular was Greenland's superfood. It provided meat, fat, essential for energy and heat, fur for clothing and tents, and even oil for lighting. Seal hunting was a dangerous and vital activity. Imagine yourself in a small boat, in icy waters, trying to shoot down an animal that is much larger and more agile than you, all while the wind freezes your nostrils and your toes. It was not a sport. It was the difference between life and death. And when the seal was brought home, every part of it was used. Nothing was wasted. Blood could be used in soups, bones for tools, and even internal organs were consumed. The fat was gold. In a climate where the body burned calories at an alarming rate just to stay warm, fat was the most efficient energy source. They ate it plain, added it to stews, and used it to preserve meat. If you're a fan of low-carb diets, the Greenland Vikings pioneered the ketogenic diet, but not by choice, but out of sheer necessity. Fresh vegetables, fruits, vitamins, forget it. The scarcity of vegetables led to severe nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was probably a constant companion, manifesting itself in bloody gums, loose teeth, and extreme fatigue. Life was a constant struggle against hunger and disease, where every meal was a reminder of the precariousness of existence. And what about the flavor? Probably monotonous. The meat was often dried, salted, or smoked for preservation. There wasn't a wide range of spices to give it a twist. Taste was secondary to the need for calories. Food was fuel, not pleasure. The idea of eating for pleasure would be an alien concept to them. They ate so as not to die. So the next time you complain about your bland salad or your mayonnaise-free sandwich, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They would have given an arm, literally if they were starving, for a piece of fresh bread, a ripe tomato, or maybe a pepperoni pizza. But all they had was seal, a lot of seals, and the promise of more focuses tomorrow. A diet that, while effective for survival, was certainly not a gastronomic delight. Hunting and fishing, the lottery of survival. If today you complain about the supermarket queue or the lack of a specific ingredient for dinner, imagine that your life literally depended on a successful hunt or a hearty catch. For the Vikings in Greenland, hunting and fishing were not weekend pastimes or sports. They were the daily lottery of survival, where the prize was life and failure meant hunger, cold, and eventually death. There was no guarantee that the next animal would appear, or that the ice would not give way under its feet, or that a storm would not swallow it into the sea. It was a high-stakes game, played every day. Think about your morning routine. Maybe a coffee, a news broadcast, a commute to work. For a Greenlandic Viking, the morning could begin with preparing for a seal hunting expedition. That meant sharpening harpoons, checking the boat's moorings if the sea was navigable, and putting on layers and layers of furs to face the biting cold. There was no weather forecast on the cell phone, just the close observation of the skies and the behavior of the sea. Every outing was a bet against nature. Seal hunting, as mentioned, was crucial. Seals were plentiful, but hunting them required skill, patience, and courage. Imagine yourself peeking through a hole in the ice, waiting for hours, motionless, as the wind whips your face and your toes threaten to freeze. When the seal finally emerges to breathe, you have a split second to launch your harpoon with deadly precision. One mistake and the seal disappears, taking with it the hope of a meal. And it wasn't just a seal for one person. It was a seal to feed a family, perhaps a community, for days. Reindeer hunting was another vital endeavor, especially in the interior. Reindeer provided meat, skins for clothing and tents, and horns for tools. But reindeer were migratory animals, and finding them required in-depth knowledge of the terrain, tracking, and physical endurance to travel long distances in an unforgiving environment. You couldn't just go to the reindeer section of your local butcher shop. One had to follow tracks in the snow, interpret subtle signs of nature, and often face the risk of getting lost in a sudden blizzard. Fishing, in turn, offered a more constant source of food, but no less dangerous. In the summer, they fished in fjords and in the open sea, using primitive nets and hooks. In winter, when the sea froze, ice fishing became the norm. That meant cutting thick holes in the ice with rudimentary tools, sitting on the ice for hours and pulling in frozen fish that barely struggled. The risk of hypothermia was constant, and a misstep could mean falling into icy water, an almost instant death sentence. And we can't forget whaling. Although less frequent, the whale was a gigantic prize, providing a massive amount of meat, blubber, and oil. But hunting a whale was a large-scale operation, requiring the coordination of multiple boats and men, and a level of danger that would make any modern shark hunter look like an amateur. An injured whale could capsize a boat, crush its occupant, or drag them into the icy depths. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, but the reward was worth the risk. Uncertainty was the constant companion. There was no guarantee of success. A day of hunting could end empty-handed, meaning that the family would have to depend on reserves, which were always limited. The psychological pressure of being the provider in such a hostile environment was immense. Imagine the anxiety of knowing that your family's hunger depends on your ability to throw a harpoon, or your luck in finding a school of fish. Compared to that, your hunt for promotions at the supermarket or fishing for a good restaurant on the app feels like a picnic in the park. They didn't have the option of ordering a pizza when the hunt failed. The only option was to try again the next day, with my stomach growling and hope waning. Life was a series of bets against nature, and with each win they only got one more day to play again. It was the survival lottery, and the Vikings of Greenland were compulsive gamblers, not out of addiction, but out of sheer and desperate necessity. Storage, the slow death food bank. If you've ever worried about the expiration date of a yogurt in your fridge, or the expiration date of a packet of cookies, get ready for a trip back in time where shelf life was measured in months of extreme cold, and the fridge was Greenland itself. For the Vikings, storing food was not a matter of convenience or avoiding waste. It was the difference between life and death, a race against time and decay, where every mistake could mean a winter of hunger and despair. It was the food bank of slow death, and the rate of interest was its very existence. Imagine summer, the short and precious window of opportunity in Greenland. This is when most of the hunting and fishing takes place. But what to do with all that seal, whale, and reindeer meat you managed to slaughter? There were no freezers, no cans, no vacuum packs. Conservation technology was rudimentary but effective, based on principles that we now consider basic, but which for them were the cutting edge of innovation. Drying was one of the most common techniques. Seal meat and fish were cut into thin strips and hung to dry in the cold, dry wind. The Greenland wind, while relentless, was an ally in this process, acting as a natural dehydrator. Imagine the smell, a pungent mixture of dried fish and cured meat, hanging in the air around the settlements. It wasn't the aroma of a Sunday barbecue, but the smell of survival. Dried meat, or skyr, was light, easy to transport, and could last for months, making it a staple for long journeys in the winter months. Salting was another vital technique. Salt was a valuable resource, often obtained through trade with Norway, or the evaporation of seawater in coastal lagoons during the rare sunny days. The meat was rubbed with salt and stacked in barrels or pits, where the salt drew moisture and inhibited the growth of bacteria. The result was an incredibly salty meat, which needed to be desalted before consumption, but which guaranteed preservation for long periods. Think of your jerky or cod. They were the original masters of this art. And fat? Ah, the fat. It was not just a source of energy, it was also a preservative. The meat could be cooked and then immersed in melted fat, which, when cooled, formed a protective layer, isolating the meat from the air and bacteria. This was especially useful for larger cuts of meat or for giblets. It was like a Viking version of a confit, but without the glamour of French cuisine. In addition, Greenland's own nature was a giant freezer. Pits dug into the permafrost, the permanently frozen ground, served as natural deposits, keeping the meat and fish frozen for months. It was the equivalent of having a walk-in freezer that never needed electricity, but also didn't have a defrost button. The downside? The meat could become so frozen that an axe was needed to cut it, and the risk of contamination by anaerobic bacteria, which thrive in oxygen-free environments, was a constant concern. Grain storage, when it existed, was a challenge. The few grains grown or imported needed to be protected from moisture and rodents. They were kept in leather bags or in small raised barns to avoid soil moisture. But the quantity was always limited, and the priority was always meat and fat. The management of these inventories was an art. It was necessary to know exactly how much of each food would be needed to support the family or community during the winter, without wasting anything, but also without going hungry. Every piece of meat, every drop of fat was accounted for. There was no room for excesses or fad diets. Food was a finite resource, and scarcity was a constant threat. The anxiety of a winter approaching, with stocks dwindling and hunting becoming more difficult, must have been overwhelming. Each meal was a reminder that the future was uncertain, and that life depended on your ability to plan, hunt, and preserve. The next time you open the door of your cramped refrigerator and sigh because you don't know what to eat, remember the Vikings of Greenland. For them, the food bank was a matter of life and death, and slow death was a very real possibility if planning failed. It was a brutal lesson in economy and resilience written in jerky and seal fat. Clothing, the second skin against ice. If you've ever felt uncomfortable on a cold day because you forgot your gloves or because your coat wasn't waterproof enough, get ready for a Viking fashion class in Greenland. For them, clothing was not a style statement or a matter of comfort. It was literally her second skin, the final and most crucial barrier between life and hypothermia. There was no Gore-Tex, no high-tech merino wool, just the brutal ingenuity of those who knew that a mistake in the choice of clothing meant a slow, icy death. Imagine waking up on a Greenlandic winter morning. The temperature outside is well below freezing. The wind howls like a hungry wolf, and the moisture in the air seems to penetrate to the bone. Your first line of defense is not an electric heater, but the layers and layers of fur and wool you wear. The base was usually a woolen tunic, perhaps 2 or 3, depending on availability. Wool, even when wet, retains some of its insulating capacity, which was a crucial advantage in an environment where dryness was a luxury. On top of the wool came the skins. And here the seal was the star of the show. Seal skin is incredibly dense and waterproof, perfect for repelling snow and wind. Imagine a seal overall, perhaps with the furry part out for greater protection from the wind, or inward for greater warmth. It wasn't exactly haute couture, but it was functional. The seams were made with animal tendons and the needles were made of bone. Each stitch was a matter of life and death, as a poorly made seam could allow the cold to enter, turning a piece of clothing into an icy trap. The feet were a chapter apart. Forget your running shoes or your modern snow boots. The Vikings wore several layers of woolen socks, often made by hand, and on top boots of sealskin or reindeer. These boots were often filled with dry grass or moss for additional insulation, which needed to be changed regularly to prevent moisture and fungus. The smell? Well, imagine the smell of sweaty feet, damp grass, and aging animal skin. It wasn't Chanel's perfume, but it kept her toes in place. The hands were protected by wool and fur gloves or mittens, essential for any outdoor activity. The face and head were covered with wool and fur hoods, leaving only a small opening for the eyes. The idea was to minimize skin exposure to cold air, avoiding frostbite and loss of body heat. You wouldn't see a Greenlandic Viking with bare ears unless he was in a hurry to lose a piece of them. The maintenance of these clothes was a constant job. The hides needed to be cleaned, dried, and treated to maintain their suppleness and impermeability. The wool needed to be washed, with whatever they had on hand, probably fermented urine, an excellent cleaning agent and softener, but with a peculiar odor, and patched up. Every tear, every hole was a vulnerability. The clothes were patched and repurposed until there was nothing left to do with them. There was no seasonal fashion, only the fashion of survival. The irony is that, to us, the idea of wearing animal fur may seem barbaric or old-fashioned, but for them, it was cutting-edge technology. It was what nature offered, and they used it masterfully. The difference between a well-dressed Viking and a poorly dressed one was not a matter of social status, but of likelihood of survival. A poorly dressed Viking was a dead Viking. Think of the feeling of being wrapped in layers of fur and wool, the weight, the stiffness, the smell. It wasn't light and breathable like your sportswear today. It was heavy, hot, and often damp inside, but it was what kept them alive. With each movement, the friction of the skins, the creaking of the wool. With each breath, the cold air that entered and the warm, humid air that left condensed into the fibers. So the next time you're choosing between your down coat and your wool coat to brave the cold, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They didn't have that choice. They had to use what nature gave them, and they had to make it work. Her second skin was a testament to her resilience, her ingenuity, and the brutality of an environment where fashion was a matter of life and death. And let's face it, they've probably never complained about neck-scratching etiquette. Fuel, the eternal quest for heat. If you've ever complained about the price of gasoline or your electricity bill in the winter, get ready for a dose of perspective. For the Vikings in Greenland, fuel was not a commodity to be bought with money. It was a vital resource to be hunted, excavated, and rationed with the same diligence with which food was hunted. Keeping the fire burning wasn't just for cooking or for lighting. It was the very pulse of life, the fine line between comforting warmth and death by freezing. The search for something that would burn was a daily battle, a fight against nature that never ended. Imagine yourself in an environment where trees are a rarity. There are no dense forests to cut firewood, nor easily accessible charcoal deposits. Greenland, for the Vikings, was a desert of ice and rock, with very little woody vegetation. The few gnarled bushes that existed were too small to provide significant fuel, and in any case they were too precious to burn, as they helped stabilize the soil and provided some fodder for the animals. So what was burned? The main answer was peat. Yes, the same peat they used to build their houses. Peat is partially decomposed plant organic matter, which forms in swamps and peatlands. It was cut into blocks, dried in the wind, a process that took time and required good weather, another luxury in Greenland, and then burned. Peat burns slowly, producing constant heat and dense, pungent smoke. The smell of burning peat was the ubiquitous aroma of Viking settlements, an earthy, slightly sulfurous smell that permeated clothes, hair, and the atmosphere itself. It wasn't the cozy smell of a wood-burning fireplace. It was the smell of survival, a constant reminder of the struggle. But peat had its drawbacks. It was heavy to transport, and peatlands were not always near settlements. Digging it was hard work, especially in a climate where the ground was often frozen. And the smoke? The smoke. Inside the poorly ventilated peat houses, the peat smoke could be suffocating, irritating the eyes and lungs. It was a price to pay for the heat, but a price that, in the long run, contributed to respiratory problems and a shorter life. In addition to peat, there were other less obvious but equally vital fuels. The most valuable of these was driftwood, tree trunks, washed away by ocean currents from Siberia or North America, washed up on Greenland's shores. Finding a good piece of driftwood was like finding gold. It was a rare and precious resource used not only as fuel but also for boat construction, tools, and repairs. The search for driftwood was a constant activity, with regular expeditions along the coast. Every piece was valued and used with the utmost parsimony. And what else? Animal fats. Yes, the same fat they ate. Seal and whale blubber was used in primitive oil lamps, providing light and some warmth. It was not a primary heat source to heat an entire house, but it was essential for lighting and to keep a small flame burning during the long, dark polar nights. The smell of burning animal fat was yet another component of the olfactory symphony of Viking houses, a rancid, heavy aroma that mixed with peat smoke. Even dried animal manure was used as fuel in some areas, especially where peat was scarce. Imagine the smell of that. It wasn't a first-choice option, but when survival is on the line, you burn what you have. Fuel management was just as critical as food management. You had to make sure that there was enough to last you all winter, and that the stock was protected from moisture. Every ember was precious. The fire was not allowed to burn unnecessarily. It was carefully maintained, smothered at night to preserve the embers, and carefully rekindled in the morning. There was no luxury of lighting a match or turning a knob. Lighting a fire from scratch in a damp, cold environment was a challenge in itself. The anxiety of running out of fuel must have been a constant shadow over their lives. A particularly harsh winter, a blizzard that prevented peat collection, or a lack of driftwood on the beaches, could mean the difference between life and death. The cold was not just a discomfort, it was an active threat, a silent predator that lurked in the shadows. So the next time you adjust the thermostat or complain about the time it takes for your car to warm up, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They didn't have the option to simply turn on the heating. They had to work, dig, hunt, and ration every bit of heat. The search for fuel was not a task. It was an obsession, a daily dance with death where the prize was the simple and glorious sensation of not freezing. And let's face it, this makes your electricity bill look like a bargain. Community. Unity is strength. And stink. If you've ever felt suffocated by your family during a long holiday, or complained about the lack of privacy in your apartment, imagine living in a peat house, where privacy was as alien a concept as a smartphone. For the Vikings in Greenland, community was not a choice, but a brutal necessity. The union was strength, yes, but it also made the stench. The lack of personal space and the forced coexistence with the same faces, day after day, in an environment where loneliness was, literally, fatal. Think about your support network today. Friends, family, co-workers, maybe even a therapist. Now strip it all away and place yourself in an isolated settlement, surrounded by miles of ice and sea. There was no going to your mother's house when things got tough, no going for a walk to cool your head. His community was his bubble of survival, and getting out of it meant facing unforgiving nature alone, which was an almost certain death sentence. Life in a Greenlandic Viking settlement was an orchestra of interdependence. No one could survive alone. Hunting large animals, such as whales or reindeer, required the coordination of several men. The construction of peat houses, the harvesting of peat for fuel, large-scale fishing, all of this was a community effort. If one member of the community failed in his task, everyone suffered. If a hunter returned empty-handed, famine loomed for all. There was no room for individualism or for the idea of, I manage on my own. Inside the peat houses, the proximity was extreme. Entire families, and sometimes even several families, lived under the same roof. Imagine the constant noise. Children crying, adults talking, animals chewing the cud, the crackling of the fire, the wind howling outside. There were no doors to close, no walls to muffle the sound. Every breath, every movement, every smell was shared. If you're the type who needs your space, Viking life in Greenland would be your worst nightmare. This forced proximity, although essential for survival, also generated tensions. Conflicts were inevitable. Small irritations could turn into big fights when there was nowhere to run. Gossip, envy, resentment, all these basic human feelings were amplified by the lack of privacy and constant coexistence. There was no option to take a break from each other. You were stuck with them, for better or worse, until death did you part. Solidarity, however, was the glue that held everything together. In an environment where nature was the common enemy, mutual aid was the only weapon. If someone got sick, the community took care of them. If a family lost its head of household, the others helped support the orphans and the widow. There was no social security system, only the informal community support network. An act of selfishness could have catastrophic consequences for everyone. Festivals and celebrations, although rare, were crucial moments to relieve tension and strengthen social bonds. Sharing a hearty meal, when there was one, telling stories, singing songs. These were the few distractions in a life of hard work and deprivation. It was a way to reaffirm the group's identity and to remind everyone that, despite the difficulties, they were in this together. Leadership was exercised by local chiefs, who were responsible for organizing hunting, distributing resources, and resolving disputes. Authority did not come from a bureaucratic role, but from the ability to lead and ensure the survival of the group. A weak or unjust leader could lead the community to ruin. Mutual dependence was so deep that the idea of being banished from the community was a punishment almost as severe as death. To be exiled meant to be left to fend for himself in an environment where nature was unforgiving. It was a slow but inevitable death sentence. Social acceptance was therefore a matter of life and death. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by the constant presence of other people, or complain about the noise of your neighbors, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They lived in a forced symbiosis, where proximity was the key to survival, but also a constant source of challenges. The community was her shield against cold and hunger, but it was also a melting pot of smells, sounds, and personalities, boiling in a confined space. Togetherness was strength, yes, but it also made the stench, and the lack of personal space was a luxury they just couldn't afford. It was a brutal lesson in human interdependence, where loneliness was not just an emotion, but a condemnation. Diseases and hygiene, the price of proximity. If you're the type who carries hand sanitizer in your purse and panics at the thought of touching public bathroom doorknobs, get ready for a trip to the past, where hygiene was as exotic a concept as a daily hot shower. For the Vikings in Greenland, the enforced proximity in their peat houses, combined with the lack of basic sanitation, turned each settlement into a hotbed of disease, where disease was a constant companion and death a frequent and unwanted visitor. It was the price of proximity, paid with one's own health. Imagine living in an environment where water is a precious resource, often frozen and difficult to obtain. Wash your hands before eating, an unthinkable luxury. Shower, an extravagance that could cost him his life from hypothermia. The idea of cleanliness was very different from ours. Clothes were rarely washed, and the body even less. The smell of sweat, dirt, and animal fat permeated everything. There were no scented soaps, just the harsh reality of a life where the priority was to survive, not to smell good. Inside the peat houses, the situation was even more critical. Humans and animals lived together in the same space, sharing air, heat, and inevitably germs. The dirt floor was a repository of dirt, food scraps, and yes, waste. There were no internal toilets. Necessities were done in buckets or in shallow pits outside the house, which were emptied as often as the cold and laziness allowed. The idea of a sewer system was science fiction. All of this created a perfect environment for the proliferation of bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Infectious diseases were a constant threat. Colds, flu, tuberculosis, pneumonia. Any of these conditions, which we now treat with a simple pill or a syrup, could be a death sentence. A common cold could develop into a fatal pneumonia in a body already weakened by malnutrition and cold. Tuberculosis, with its persistent cough and fever, was probably endemic, spreading easily in closed and overcrowded environments. And it wasn't just respiratory diseases. Poor hygiene in food preparation and the consumption of raw or undercooked meat could lead to severe gastrointestinal infections. Diarrhea and dysentery, while not as dramatic as a plague, could quickly dehydrate and kill, especially children and the elderly. Intestinal parasites were likely a daily reality, causing discomfort and robbing already hungry bodies of precious nutrients. Malnutrition, as we have seen, was a chronic problem. A lack of vitamin C led to scurvy, a debilitating disease that caused bleeding gums, tooth loss, joint pain, and extreme fatigue. A body weakened by malnutrition was much more susceptible to any infection. Anemia, due to a lack of iron, was also common, contributing to weakness and lethargy. There were no doctors, no hospitals, no antibiotics. Treatment was based on folk remedies, herbs when available, and mainly on faith and the resilience of one's own body. A shaman or a wise woman from the community might offer some help, but most illnesses were simply endured, with the hope that the body would recover on its own. Death was an intrinsic part of life, and life expectancy was significantly lower than ours. Infant mortality was frighteningly high. Young children with immune systems still developing were particularly vulnerable to infectious diseases and malnutrition. The loss of children was a common tragedy, a pain that was repeated in every family. The irony is that the same closeness that was essential for survival in terms of cooperation and human warmth was also the vector of its own destruction. The heat and humidity inside the peat houses, so necessary to keep the cold at bay, created the perfect environment for pathogens to proliferate. The lack of ventilation, the smoke from the peat, and the coexistence with animals only made the situation worse. So the next time you're tempted to skip hand washing or complain about the smell of disinfectant in the hospital, remember the Vikings of Greenland. For them, hygiene was a luxury they could not afford, and disease was an inevitable part of their existence. With every cough, every fever, every stomachache, they faced the real possibility that this could be the end. It was the price of proximity, paid with one's own health and often with one's own life. And let's face it, this makes your water bill look like a bargain. The polar night, the madness of darkness. If you've ever felt a little down on a cloudy winter day or complained about the lack of sunlight in your office, get ready to immerse yourself in the Greenlandic polar night experience. For the Vikings, it wasn't just the absence of sun for a few hours. It was perpetual darkness, an oppressive cloak that covered the land for months on end, turning day into a brighter version of night, and testing the limits of human sanity. It was the madness of darkness, an invisible enemy that corroded the soul as relentlessly as the cold corroded the body. Imagine yourself living in a place where the sun simply refuses to appear on the horizon for weeks, sometimes months. In Greenland, depending on the latitude of the settlement, the polar night could last from a few weeks to several months. What you would see was not the total darkness of a cave, but an eternal twilight, a bluish-gray penumbra that barely distinguished the sky from the ground. The stars and the aurora borealis could be spectacular, yes, but they were a constant reminder of the vastness and indifference of the universe, not a substitute for the warmth and vitality of the sun. The psychological impact of this prolonged darkness was immense. Today we call it seasonal affective disorder, SAD, or SAD, for those close to us. But for the Vikings there was no name, only the brutal reality of a growing lethargy, a deep melancholy that set in with the arrival of winter. The lack of sunlight affects the production of serotonin and melatonin, disrupting the biological clock and leading to symptoms such as chronic fatigue, irritability, difficulty concentrating, and an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. There were no light therapy lamps, no vitamin D capsules, just darkness and her own resilience. Think about monotony. The days mingled in an indistinct mass of gloom. There was no natural rhythm of sunrise and sunset to guide activities. Outdoor tasks became even more dangerous and difficult. Life retreated into the peat houses, where the only light came from the fireplace and the oil lamps of animal fat, which barely illuminated the nearest corners. The smoke from peat, the smell of sweat and animals, the constant noise of forced coexistence, all of this was amplified by darkness. Isolation was another cruel factor. With the frozen sea and frequent snowfall, communication with other settlements or the outside world was virtually impossible. Communities became islands of life in an ocean of ice and darkness. The lack of new information, new faces, new perspectives, contributed to a sense of confinement and mental stagnation. The stories told around the fire, the songs sung, the legends passed down from generation to generation. These were the few windows to a larger world, a way to keep the mind active and hope alive. Madness, or what today we would call severe depression, was a real threat. The lack of stimulation, the sensory deprivation, the constant struggle for survival, all this added up to an almost unbearable psychological burden. How many Vikings would have succumbed to this disease of darkness, losing the will to fight, to hunt, to live? There are no records, but it is easy to imagine that the suicide rate and mental breakdowns were significantly high. To combat this inner darkness, they depended on social structure, routine, and faith. Daily tasks, as arduous as they were, provided a purpose. Living with family and community, despite their tensions, offered companionship and support. Beliefs in the Norse gods, sagas, and rituals provided a sense of order and meaning in a chaotic world. The hope of the sun's return, even if distant, was a beacon in the midst of darkness. Today, if you feel depressed in the winter, you can travel to a sunny place, use a light therapy lamp, or simply turn on the television and watch a movie. For the Vikings, there was no escape. Darkness was an undeniable reality, an intrinsic part of his existence. They could not run away from it. They had to face it day after day, night after night, until the promise of the sun returned. So the next time you complain about bad weather, or your lack of energy on a gray day, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They lived in a world where light was a luxury and darkness a constant. The polar night was not just an astronomical phenomenon, it was a psychological ordeal, a test of mental endurance that few of us today would be able to endure. It was the madness of darkness, and the only cure was patience and hope that the sun would eventually remember to return. Commerce, the fine line with the outside world. If today you complain about the delay of your international order or the expensive shipping of an imported product, get ready to understand what a supply line really was for the Vikings in Greenland. For them, trade was not a convenience for acquiring luxury goods. It was a thin and precarious line that connected them to the outside world, a vital artery that brought the few resources that Greenland refused to provide. It was a high-risk gamble, where the failure of a single ship could mean the difference between survival and total isolation. Slow death. Imagine yourself in an isolated settlement surrounded by an icy sea and an inhospitable continent. You don't have iron for tools, wood to build ships or decent houses, and your fields barely produce enough grain to feed a mouse. What do? You exchange. And what did Greenland have to offer that the rest of the world wanted? Mainly, walrus ivory. Yes, those long curved teeth were Arctic white gold, highly prized in Europe for carvings, jewelry, and objets d'art. Think of a walrus tooth as the Viking equivalent of a diamond in the rough. In addition to ivory, they exported polar bear skins, an exotic luxury for European nobility, seal skins, game falcons, especially the gyrfalcon, an Arctic predator coveted by kings and lords, and perhaps some wool and reindeer skins. These were the products that Greenland, in its icy generosity, could offer. They were the only goods that could be exchanged for what they desperately needed. And what did they need? Iron. Above all, Greenland had no accessible iron ore deposits, and without iron there are no durable tools, no effective weapons, no nails to fix a boat. Every piece of iron was precious, forged and reforged until there was nothing left to do with it. Wood was another vital item. While driftwood was a blessing, it was not enough to build and maintain a fleet of ships or for the most complex structures. Grains, such as wheat and rye, were also imported to supplement the meat and fat-based diet. In addition to these essentials, there were the luxuries that maintained morals and connection to civilization. Church bells, wine for mass, ecclesiastical vestments, and perhaps even some more elaborate metal objects. The church, with its tithes and its need to keep the faith, was one of the main engines of this trade. Trade travel was epic and dangerous. Ships sailed from Norway and Iceland, braving the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, filled with icebergs, violent storms, and dense fog. A round trip could take months, and many ships simply disappeared, swallowed by the icy sea. Each arrival of a ship was an event of celebration, a collective relief as it meant that the lifeline was still intact. The absence of a ship, on the other hand, brought with it a growing anxiety, the seed of despair. Over time, that fine line began to break. The Little Ice Age brought colder seas and more frequent storms, making travel even more dangerous and less predictable. The demand for walrus ivory in Europe decreased with the arrival of elephant ivory from Africa, which was easier to obtain. Norway, which controlled trade with Greenland, faced its own internal and external problems, and interest in keeping this distant and dangerous route waned. The result was increasing isolation. Ships became rarer and supplies scarcer. The Vikings of Greenland found themselves increasingly alone, forced to rely solely on their own limited resources. The lack of iron, for example, is visible in the archaeological finds. Tools and weapons became smaller, more patched, and eventually replaced by equivalents of bone and stone, a technological setback that demonstrates desperation. Think about your life today, connected by global supply chains that bring in food from all corners of the world, electronics assembled on distant continents, and clothing made from materials you've never seen. If this global network failed, even for a few weeks, chaos would ensue. For the Greenland Vikings, this failure was not a hypothesis. It was a slow and inexorable reality. The history of Greenlandic trade is a grim lesson in the fragility of human interconnectedness in a hostile environment. They didn't have the option to buy local when the local didn't produce what was essential. They depended on a thin line stretched across an unforgiving ocean, and when that line broke, the fate of their colony was sealed. It was a vital gamble, and in the end, they lost. Faith and superstition, the consolation of the frost gods. If today you seek solace in a self-help podcast, a therapy session, or perhaps a series marathon on Netflix, get ready to understand how the Vikings in Greenland dealt with existential despair. For them, the consolation came not from a motivational guru, but from the gods. First the Norseman, then the Christian, who, let's face it, seemed to be as frozen as they were. Faith and superstition were not just a matter of spiritual belief. They were a coping mechanism, a way to make sense of a world that seemed determined to crush them. Imagine yourself in a place where nature is an overwhelming and unpredictable force. The sun fades for months, snowstorms can last for weeks, hunting is uncertain, and the disease can take an entire family. In such a scenario, where human control is minimal, it is natural to look for explanations and hope in something greater. To the early settlers, this meant the gods of the Norse pantheon: Odin, the All-Father; Thor, the god of thunder; Freya, the goddess of love and fertility. They were powerful, but also capricious deities who needed to be appeased with sacrifices and rituals. The transition to Christianity, which occurred gradually from the 10th century onwards, was not only a change of dogma, it was a practical adaptation. The Christian God, though perhaps less dramatic than Thor, offered a promise of salvation and a sense of order in a chaotic universe. The Church, with its hierarchical structure and its rituals, provided a social and moral anchor point. The masses, held in peat and stone churches, cold and dark, were one of the few moments of formal community gathering, a respite from monotony and hard work. The smell of incense, however scarce, mingled with the smell of sweat and smoke, creating an atmosphere that, to them, was sacred. But make no mistake, faith was not a panacea. Life continued to be brutal. The difference was that there was now a motive for suffering: sin, divine trial, and a promise of reward after death. For a people living on the brink of starvation and hypothermia, the idea of a warm, bountiful paradise must have been incredibly appealing. Heaven for them was probably a place with an abundance of firewood, fresh meat, and who knows, good wine. Superstition, in turn, filled in the gaps where formal faith did not reach. They believed in spirits of the earth, in omens, in good luck charms. Before a hunt, rituals were performed to ensure success. To ward off disease, certain herbs or invocations were used. The line between the sacred and the profane was thin, and daily life was permeated by beliefs that aimed to control the uncontrollable. If a hunter came back empty-handed, it wasn't just bad luck. Perhaps he had offended a nature spirit or forgotten to make an offering. The Church in Greenland, though isolated, maintained ties with Europe. Bishops were appointed by Norway, and tithes were sent to Rome. Or at least they should be. This meant that the Greenlandic community was not completely disconnected from the Christian world. Faith was a cultural link, a way to maintain their European identity in an environment that constantly challenged them to become something different. Hopelessness, however, must have tested the faith of many. When crops failed repeatedly, when ships stopped arriving, when famine knocked at the door, it was hard not to question the benevolence of the gods. The Icelandic sagas, which narrate the story of the settlers, show a resilient people, but also deeply aware of the fragility of life. Black humor, so present in Nordic culture, was perhaps a way of dealing with this hopelessness, of laughing in the face of death and fate. Today, when we face a crisis, we look for scientific, technological solutions, or we turn to material comfort. For the Vikings, science was the empirical observation of the world around them, and technology their rudimentary tools. When all else failed, faith remained. It was a consolation, yes, but also a form of resignation, the acceptance that there were greater forces at play, and that fate, as cruel as it was in the hands of the gods. So the next time you feel lost or hopeless and think about calling a friend or looking for a motivational video, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They didn't have those options. They had to find their solace in an icy world, where the gods seemed as far away as the sun in winter. Faith and superstition were their anchors, their compasses in a sea of uncertainty, and, strange as it may seem, they were what kept them, somehow, warm inside. It was an icy consolation, but it was the only one they had. Tools, the simplicity of survival. If you've ever felt frustrated because your smartphone crashed or because your cordless drill's battery died in the middle of a project, get ready for a humbling lesson from the past. For the Vikings in Greenland, tools were not state-of-the-art gadgets or disposable consumer objects. They were extensions of his hands forged with sweat and necessity, and each of them was a treasure. The ingenuity behind the few instruments they owned was the key to their survival, a testament that simplicity, when combined with necessity, can be the most sophisticated of technologies. Imagine a world without hardware stores, without online catalogs, without the ability to simply buy what you need. Each tool was an investment of time, energy, and resources. Iron, as we have already said, was an imported luxury, a precious metal that arrived in limited quantities. Every piece of iron was prized, forged, and reforged, until there was nothing left to do with it. An iron axe wasn't just a tool, it was an inheritance, passed down from generation to generation, perhaps with a story every time it saved a life or built a home. Think of the axe. Not the gleaming battle axe you see in Viking movies, but a working axe, with an iron blade and a floating wooden handle. It was the multi-purpose tool par excellence, to cut peat, to split bones, to dismember carcasses, to defend oneself from a hungry polar bear. It was the Swiss Greenland knife, but much heavier and with fewer functions. And when the blade became dull, there was no electric sharpener. It took patience and a whetstone, manual work that required time and skill. Knives were equally essential. Small, large, for cutting meat, for scraping skins, for carving wood. Each family would have several, and the quality of a knife could mean the difference between a well-prepared meal and a frustrating struggle with a piece of frozen meat. The skill of a blacksmith, who could turn a piece of raw iron into a sharp blade, was one of the most valued in the community. But what to do when iron was scarce? Human ingenuity came into play. Whale, seal, and reindeer bones were turned into tools. Bone needles for sewing skins, bone harpoon tips for hunting, bone shovels for digging. Reindeer antlers were used to make combs, spoons, and even small amulets. Stone was also used, especially for fishing weights, hammers, and occasionally rougher blades. Nature provided the raw material, and necessity, the inspiration. Imagine the patience it takes to turn a bone into a needle thin enough to sew a sealskin without tearing it, or to sharpen a bone harpoon tip so that it penetrates the thick layer of fat from a seal. There were no machines, just calloused hands, watchful eyes, and a deep understanding of materials. Hunting and fishing tools were the most crucial. Harpoons, spears, hooks, nets made of animal sinews or plant fibers, where available. Each of these items was the bridge between hunger and plenty. The loss of a harpoon on a hunt could be a disaster. The maintenance of these tools was a constant task, a daily ritual of sharpening, repairing, and preparing for the next use. And what about tools for domestic life? Wooden bowls, often made of driftwood, bone spoons, skin containers. Everything was made to be durable and functional. There was no room for the superfluous. Each object had a purpose and was used to the limit of its useful life. The lack of specialized tools meant that many tasks were more time-consuming and required more physical effort. Building a peat house without metal shovels, cutting firewood without efficient saws, processing hides without modern scraping tools. It was all hard and time-consuming work. Life was a series of physical challenges, and tools were the few allies they had. Today, we are surrounded by tools that make our lives easier, many of which we haven't even thought about. We open a can with an electric opener, cut a piece of meat with a ceramic knife, build furniture with electric screwdrivers. For the Vikings, each tool was a reminder of their dependence on nature and their own ingenuity. So the next time you feel frustrated with modern technology or complain that your lawnmower doesn't work, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They lived in a world where simplicity was a virtue and durability was a necessity. His tools were few, but they were the difference between life and death. And, let's face it, a hand-forged iron axe would probably last longer than any gadget you have today. Livestock, miniature cattle, and the winter dilemma. If you've ever stressed about your pet's diet or vet bill, get ready for a dose of reality about Viking livestock farming in Greenland. For them, raising animals was not a hobby or an easy-to-profit business. It was a high-stakes gamble against nature, where every cow, sheep, or goat was a life-and-death investment, and winter was the grand jury that decided who would live and who would become salted meat. It was the dilemma of winter, a brutal calculation of resources versus survival. Picture the scene. You, a Viking farmer looking at your small flock. It wasn't the giant dairy cows we see today, nor the woolly sheep that look like walking clouds. They were smaller, more rustic races, adapted to harsh climates, but still, creatures that needed to eat and stay warm. Each animal was a precious resource. Milk for drinking and making cheese, meat for eating, wool for spinning and weaving, skins for clothing and tents, and even dung for fertilizing the few fields, or, as a last resort, for burning as fuel. The great challenge, the dilemma that haunted every Greenlandic farmer, was winter. Greenland was not a place where grass grew plentiful and lush. The growing season was short and forage was scarce. This meant that every gram of hay had to be collected and stored with the utmost care. Imagine yourself mowing thin grass on rocky slopes, drying it in the wind, and piling it into rudimentary barns, knowing that the lives of your animals depended on that pile of straw. There were no tractors, no balers, only sickles and calloused hands. And when hay wasn't enough, creativity, driven by desperation, entered the scene. They fed their animals what they could: seaweed collected from the coast, leaves from bushes, fish remains, and even the entrails of hunted animals. It wasn't the ideal diet, but it was enough to keep them alive, or at least to postpone the inevitable. The cold was another implacable enemy. The animals could not simply be outdoors during the winter. They needed shelter. And where did they shelter them? Often within the peat houses themselves, in an area separated by a low wall, or in adjacent stables that shared human warmth. Imagine the smell, a heady mix of smoke, human and animal sweat, dung, urine, and the warm breath of various confined creatures. It was not the aroma of a flowering field, but the smell of shared survival. The presence of the animals helped to heat the house, but it also increased humidity and the risk of diseases. Water was also a problem. In winter, everything froze. Snow or ice had to be melted to give the animals water, a task that consumed precious time and fuel. Each bucket of water was an effort. And then came the most difficult decision: winter slaughter. There was no way to keep all the animals alive during the colder months. Resources were limited. So before winter hit, farmers had to make a painful choice. Which animals would be slaughtered to save hay and ensure the rest had a chance of surviving? The oldest, the weakest, the ones who didn't produce well, they were the first to go. It was an economically and emotionally devastating decision, but a necessary one. The meat was then salted, dried, or smoked, adding to winter stocks. Cattle ranching in Greenland was a constant balancing act. It was necessary to have enough animals to meet the needs of the family, but not so many that they could not be fed and sheltered. Each birth was a blessing, but also a new challenge. Every death, a loss. Today, animal agriculture is a massive industry, with balanced feeds, veterinarians on hand, and heating systems for the animals. You can buy meat and milk at the grocery store without thinking about the struggle it was to produce them. For the Vikings, every drop of milk, every piece of meat, every thread of wool was the result of a Herculean effort, of a daily battle against the elements. Think of the anxiety of seeing your animals lose weight, of hearing their faint moos, knowing that the end of winter was still far away. The connection between the farmer and his flock was deep, not just out of affection, but out of a mutual dependence. Their lives depended on the lives of animals, and vice versa. So the next time you complain about the price of meat or milk, or the difficulty of caring for your pet, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They didn't have the option to outsource the feeding or care of their animals. They lived with them, smelled them, and made the most difficult choices to ensure the survival of both. It was a constant dilemma, a daily struggle, and winter was the great executioner that decided the fate of each creature. Waste, the dirty side of Viking life. If you've ever been annoyed by selective collection, the amount of garbage your home produces, or a clogged sink, get ready for a trip to the past where the concept of disposal was an art and sustainability was a matter of pure necessity, not environmental awareness. For the Vikings in Greenland, garbage and waste were not a problem to be hidden in black bags or taken to a landfill. They were an intrinsic part of daily life, a smelly and inevitable reality in a society with no plumbing, no garbage collection, and no idea that there would ever be smart trash cans. Imagine yourself living in an environment where every resource is precious. Nothing is really garbage in the modern sense of the word. Every bone, every piece of skin, every plant fiber had a potential use. Food scraps, for example, were not thrown away. They were fed to the animals, used as fertilizer for the few fields, or simply left to the dogs and other animals that roamed the settlement. The idea of food waste was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. Every calorie counted. But what about human waste? Oh, that's the part that makes your septic tank look like a luxury spa. There were no internal toilets, no flushes, no toilet paper. Reliefs were done in buckets inside houses, especially during long, icy winters, or in shallow pits dug outside. These buckets were emptied as often as cold and decency allowed, usually in dung heaps or in designated areas on the outskirts of the settlement. Imagine the smell, especially in the summer, when the ice melted and the sun, even if weak, began to warm the air. It was a symphony of organic odors, a constant reminder of human and animal presence. Piles of garbage and waste were a ubiquitous feature of Viking settlements. It wasn't just mountains of dirt. They were archaeological deposits in formation. Hunted animal bones, mollusk shells, pottery shards, broken tools, wood scraps, and peat. Everything piled up. Over time, these piles became mounds, and archaeologists today call them middens. For us, they are treasures of information about Viking life. To them, they were only the inevitable result of life. The management of this waste was, in fact, a form of organic recycling. Animal and human manure, mixed with food scraps and ashes from the hearth, was a valuable fertilizer for the fields. In a poor and depleted soil, every nutrient was welcome. There was no organized composting, but nature did its job, breaking down organic matter and returning it to the earth. Lack of proper sanitation, as we have already discussed, was a crucial factor in the spread of disease. The proximity of waste piles to water sources, often shallow wells or streams, and to homes themselves created an environment conducive to bacteria and parasites. Flies and rodents were attracted to the waste, acting as vectors of disease. Diarrhea and other gastrointestinal infections were likely a constant reality, contributing to high mortality, especially among children. Water for drinking and cooking was obtained from natural sources, such as streams and wells or by melting snow and ice. Awareness of water contamination was limited. They had no idea that the water that seemed clean could be full of invisible microorganisms that caused disease. Life was a constant bet against the invisible. Despite all the dirt and stench, there was a brutal logic to the way they handled their waste. It was a circular economy forced by necessity. Each element was reused, recycled, or returned to nature in some way. There was no luxury of simply throwing it away. Life was a continuous cycle of consumption and reuse where today's garbage was tomorrow's resource. Think of your trash can full of plastic packaging, leftover food you didn't eat, clothes you used a few times. For a Viking, this would be a crime. They lived in a world where scarcity was the norm and each item had an intrinsic value. The idea of discarding something that could still have a use would be unthinkable. So the next time you complain about the smell of your recycling bin or the complexity of recycling, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They lived in a world where garbage was a visible, fragrant part of the landscape, and waste was a daily reality. There was no plumbing, no garbage collection, just the need to deal with what life produced. It was the dirty side of Viking life, a brutal lesson in the interconnectedness between life, death, and what we leave behind. And let's face it, that makes your sewer system look like a marvel of modern engineering. Water, the precious and frozen liquid. If you've ever complained about tap water tasting weird, or if you spend a fortune on bottled mineral water because it's purer, get ready for a dose of liquid humility. For the Vikings in Greenland, water was not a right or a convenience. It was a precious, often frozen resource that required Herculean effort to obtain. In a world where everything was ice and snow, the search for clean water was a daily task, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the brutality of the environment. It was the precious, frozen liquid, and every drop was a victory. Imagine waking up on a winter morning with a dry throat and the need to cook. You can't just turn on a faucet. The water you need is in a solid state, whether it's in the form of soft snow, compact ice, or a frozen stream. The first task of the day was often collection. That meant going out into the biting cold, with a bucket or a bag, and starting to scrape clear snow or break chunks of ice. It couldn't be just any snow. Dirty or yellowish snow was avoided, and the search for fresh white snow, away from the settlements and their waste, was a priority. Once collected, the snow or ice needed to be transported back to the peat house. Imagine carrying heavy buckets of ice, slipping in the snow with the wind whipping your face and your toes numb. There were no shortcuts, no wheelbarrows, just brute force and determination. And then the most crucial part, melting. Melting ice and snow required heat, and heat meant fuel. Every piece of peat burned, every piece of precious driftwood was a sacrifice to turn the solid into liquid. Large iron or ceramic pots were placed over the fireplace, and ice was added slowly, so as not to extinguish the fire. The process was time-consuming and inefficient. A pot full of snow melted to become just a small amount of water. Peat smoke permeated the air, and the vapor from the meltwater mixed with the smell of sweat and animals, creating a humid and dense atmosphere inside the house. The taste of water, probably with a slight hint of smoke and a hint of earthiness, but for them, it was the taste of life. In addition to snow and ice, some communities had access to natural springs. Streams that flowed from glaciers or underground springs could provide liquid water even in winter, but these sources were rare, often far away, and subject to freezing and extreme temperatures. They were also vulnerable to contamination, especially if they were near human or animal waste disposal areas. Water from wells, dug into the permafrost, was another option, but digging a well in permanently frozen soil was a monumental task, and the water extracted was cold, requiring heating before consumption. The scarcity of liquid water had profound implications for hygiene. Washing one's body, clothes, or even one's hands was a luxury. Water was rationed for the most basic needs, drinking and cooking. This contributed to the proliferation of diseases, as we have already discussed. The lack of water for personal hygiene meant that dirt and odors were an inevitable part of daily life. Clothes were rarely washed, and bathing was a dangerous experience, reserved for very special occasions, if at all. And it wasn't just humans who needed water. Animals, especially cattle sheltered in or near homes, also needed to drink. This added an extra layer of work and fuel consumption. Imagine having to melt enough water for a flock of sheep and a few cows, day after day for months. It was an incessant task with no time off. The anxiety of running out of drinking water must have been a constant shadow. A blizzard that prevented collection, a source that froze completely, or a lack of fuel to melt the ice. Any of these scenarios could lead to a crisis. Dehydration, while less dramatic than hypothermia, was a silent and insidious threat, weakening the body and making it more vulnerable to other diseases. Today, water arrives at your home with the simple turn of a faucet. Clean, drinkable, and at the temperature you want. You use it for drinking, cooking, washing, watering the garden, filling the pool. For the Vikings of Greenland, every glass of water was the result of considerable effort, a victory over a hostile environment. So the next time you leave the faucet running while brushing your teeth, or complain about the price of your water bill, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They lived in a world where water was a luxury and every drop was earned with sweat and sacrifice. It was the precious frozen liquid, and the struggle to obtain it was an intrinsic part of his existence, a brutal lesson in the value of something we now take for granted. The Little Ice Age, the invisible enemy. If today you worry about climate change, global warming, and the scientific reports that predict bleak futures, get ready for a trip to the past where the enemy was invisible, silent, and equally implacable. For the Vikings in Greenland, the Little Ice Age was not a scientific concept or a topic of political debate. It was a gradual and insidious reality, a slow and inexorable cooling that sealed the fate of their settlements. It was an enemy they couldn't fight with axes or sagas, only endure as the world around them became increasingly inhospitable. Imagine living in a world where the climate is your main adversary. but you don't have a clue what's happening on a global scale. There were no satellites, no climate models, no UN conferences. What they noticed was that winters were getting longer and harsher. Blizzards were more frequent and intense. Sea ice became thicker and more persistent, blocking shipping lanes for longer each year. The glaciers advanced, swallowing pastures and arable fields. It was not an abrupt change, but a slow decline, like water flowing from a leaky bucket, imperceptible in everyday life, but devastating in the long run. The Little Ice Age, which extended roughly from the 14th to the 19th century, was not a full-blown ice age, but a period of significant cooling in various parts of the northern hemisphere. For the Norse settlements in Greenland, who were already living on the edge of subsistence, this cooling was the last straw, or rather the ultimate snowflake. Average temperatures dropped, and this had a ripple effect on all aspects of their lives. First, agriculture. The few fields of barley and rye they could cultivate were already marginal. With longer winters and shorter, cooler summers, the growing season has shrunk even further. Harvests became even more scarce and uncertain, forcing them to rely even more on hunting and fishing. Imagine the frustration of sowing with hope, only to see your plants wither under a summer that never really came. Secondly, livestock. Cattle, sheep, and goats needed fodder. With less grass growing and more snow covering the ground for longer, hay production has become a nearly impossible task. More animals had to be slaughtered in the fall, and those that remained were harder to keep alive during the winter. The sight of emaciated, hungry animals, shivering with cold, must have been a constant reminder of the struggle. Third, hunting and fishing. Although marine life was abundant, rising sea ice made it difficult to access hunting and fishing grounds. Seal and whale hunting trips have become more dangerous and less productive. Ice prevented boats from sailing, and extreme weather conditions made outdoor life a constant hazard. The uncertainty of the next meal increased every year. Fourth, trade. The already tenuous lifeline connecting them to Europe became almost impossible to maintain. Merchant ships faced colder seas with more icebergs and more violent storms. Journeys have become longer, more dangerous, and less frequent. The flow of essential goods, such as iron and wood, decreased until it ceased. The isolation deepened, and the Greenlandic community found itself increasingly alone, with its resources dwindling and its technology regressing. And the psychological impact? How do you deal with an enemy that has no face, that cannot be traded or defeated in battle? They didn't know it was global climate change. They probably interpreted it as a series of exceptionally bad winters, perhaps divine punishment, or simply fate. Hopelessness must have set in, a sense that no matter how hard they tried, nature was against them. Human resilience has its limits, and the Little Ice Age tested those limits to the breaking point. In contrast to the Vikings, the Inuit, who already inhabited Greenland, were much more adapted to these conditions. They had an in-depth knowledge of the Arctic environment. Their hunting and building techniques were perfectly suited to ice and snow, and their diet was based on marine resources that thrived in the cold. While the Vikings tried to maintain a European lifestyle in an environment that refused to cooperate, the Inuit lived in harmony with it. This difference in adaptation was crucial for the survival of one group and the disappearance of the other. Today, we talk about adaptation and mitigation of climate change. We have the science to alert us, the technology to help us understand, and, theoretically, the ability to act. The Vikings of Greenland had none of that. They were passengers on a slowly sinking ship, not knowing why the water was rising. The Little Ice Age was the invisible enemy that silently tightened the knot around their necks until there was no air left to breathe. So the next time you get a chill in winter and think about turning on the heating, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They faced global cooling with no idea what was happening, without the technology to adapt, and without the hope that things would get better. The Little Ice Age was the final blow, a grim reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you can't see, but that you feel in every bone of your body. The decline, the silent end of a saga. If you've ever felt discouraged by seeing a store close its doors or a project being abandoned, prepare yourself for a story of decline on a much larger and much cooler scale. For the Vikings in Greenland, the end didn't come with an epic battle or a devastating plague that wiped out the population in days. No, the end was much more insidious, an icy whisper that became a deafening silence. It was the silent end of a saga, not a scream, but a slow and inexorable withering like a candle that goes out in the darkness. Imagine a community that for centuries has struggled against the elements, against hunger, against isolation. They built houses, raised families, kept their faith and their traditions. But around the 14th century things began to change. Not suddenly, but gradually. Almost imperceptibly in everyday life, like water that slowly flows from a leaky bucket. Winters have become harsher, summers shorter and colder. The Little Ice Age, that invisible enemy we have already mentioned, squeezed his icy embrace. The consequences were cascading. Agriculture, already marginal, has become almost impossible. The few grains they could grow withered in the frozen ground. Hay production for cattle declined each year, forcing the slaughter of more animals in the fall, leaving less for breeding. Seal and whale meat, while still available, was more difficult to obtain due to increased sea ice, which blocked the fjords and made navigation dangerous. It was as if the earth itself was slowly closing its doors, saying, "You are not welcome here." And trade, that thin line with the outside world, it broke. Ships from Norway and Iceland, which brought the vital iron, the timber, and the few luxuries, became increasingly rare. The trips were more dangerous, less profitable. Europe had its own problems. The Black Death decimated populations, wars, and internal conflicts diverted attention and resources. Greenland, so distant and inhospitable, has simply ceased to be a priority. Imagine the anguish of waiting for a ship that never arrives, of seeing your iron stores dwindle, your tools break without replacement, your clothes frayed without new furs or wool. The lack of iron in particular was devastating. Without it, tools became less efficient, hunting more difficult, construction more precarious. Archaeologists have found evidence that Greenlandic Vikings began to use more and more bones and stones for their tools, a technological setback that demonstrates desperation. It was as if they were slowly returning to the Stone Age, while the rest of Europe was advancing. Social rigidity and lack of adaptation also played a role. The Vikings, despite their resilience, insisted on maintaining a European lifestyle in an Arctic environment. They tried to farm, raise cattle, build stone churches, even when nature screamed that these practices were unsustainable. Meanwhile, the Inuit, who already inhabited Greenland, prospered. They lived in snow igloos, hunted with bone harpoons, used kayaks, and sealskin clothing that was perfectly adapted to their surroundings. They did not try to impose their culture on the land. They adapted to it. The Vikings, on the other hand, seemed unable or unwilling to learn from their Arctic neighbors. So how was the end? There was no massacre, no great mass migration. It was wasting away. Families, one by one, stopped having children. The older ones died, and there were no young people to replace them. The most marginal farms were abandoned first, their inhabitants perhaps moving to larger settlements or simply dying of hunger and cold. The peat houses, once full of life, became silent, their walls slowly crumbling under the weight of snow and time. The last written records of contact with Greenland date back to 1408, a marriage in the Church of Valsey. After that, silence. There are no reports of sunken ships with starving survivors, nor of desperate pleas for help. Only silence. It is likely that the last Vikings simply died of hunger, disease, or cold one by one in their peat houses, as the ice advanced and the outside world forgot about them. It's a dark story, but it teaches us a lot about the fragility of civilization and the importance of adaptation. They had no idea that they were living through the end of their era, that the climate was changing irreversibly, that the world was forgetting about them. They just kept fighting, day after day, until there was no more fighting to be fought. So the next time you feel powerless in the face of great challenges, or think that history is always about great heroes and dramatic events, remember the silent end of the Greenland Vikings. They were not defeated by an army, but by an invisible and implacable enemy, the indifference of nature, and the fragility of their own choices. His saga ended not with a bang, but with a whisper, a grim reminder that sometimes the greatest challenge is simply knowing when to stop fighting the inevitable. Inuit, the true masters of the Arctic. If you've ever felt proud of your cutting-edge technology, your super insulating jacket, or your GPS that guides you through any terrain, get ready for a humbling lesson from a people who dominated the Arctic long before any Viking even dreamed of setting foot in Greenland. For the Inuit, survival was not a constant struggle against nature but a harmonious dance with it. a testimony that true mastery lies not in mastering one's surroundings, but in adapting to it with wisdom and ingenuity. They were the true masters of the Arctic, and their wisdom contrasted sharply with Viking stubbornness. Picture the scene. On one side, the Vikings trying to replicate their European farms on frozen soil, eating seal meat out of necessity but dreaming of bread and cheese. On the other, the Inuit, living in igloos that were marvels of thermal engineering, hunting seals and whales with an efficiency that would make any Viking hunter blush with envy, and wearing clothes that were the epitome of functionality and warmth. It was not a question of better or worse, but of adapted versus unadapted. The Inuit, who had inhabited the Arctic for millennia, developed an intimate and deep knowledge of their surroundings. They knew how to read the ice, predict the weather, track animals with astonishing accuracy. Their hunting techniques were perfectly adjusted to the available resources. The kayak, for example, was a masterpiece of design. Lightweight, fast, and incredibly stable, allowing a single hunter to quietly approach seals and whales. Their harpoons, made of bone and sinew, were designed to penetrate the thick skin of marine animals and break free from the shaft, allowing the hunting line to be used to tire out prey. And the clothes? While the Vikings wrapped themselves in layers of wool and furs that could get damp and heavy, the Inuit wore caribou and sealskin clothing, sewn together with sinews and bone needles, creating a layering system that trapped air and provided superior insulation. Their parkas with fur-lined hoods were designed to protect the face from the biting wind. The boots, made of sealskin, were waterproof and insulating. They didn't just dress for the cold, they dressed to live in the cold, with an understanding of thermodynamics that far surpassed that of the Vikings. Inuit dwellings were also an example of adaptation. The igloos, built from blocks of compacted snow, were incredibly efficient. Snow is an excellent insulator, and the dome design allowed body heat and the warmth of a small seal oil lamp to warm the interior to surprisingly comfortable temperatures, even when outside the temperature was tens of degrees below zero. The smell inside an igloo was of seal oil smoke, blubber, and of course the human smell, but it was a smell of warmth and safety. The Inuit diet was almost exclusively based on meat and blubber from marine animals, seals, whales, fish. They did not try to cultivate. They embraced the abundance of the sea. This diet, rich in fats and proteins, provided the energy needed to survive in the extreme cold. And crucially, they obtained vitamin C from raw animal organs such as whale liver and skin, avoiding the scurvy that likely afflicted the Vikings. The Inuits' relationship with the environment was one of respect and interdependence. They did not see nature as something to be conquered, but as a partner. Their spiritual beliefs were deeply rooted in the land and animals, and their hunting practices were sustainable, ensuring that resources were available for future generations. The contrast with the Vikings is stark. The Vikings tried to impose their European way of life on Greenland by bringing cattle, trying to grow grain, and building houses out of stone and peat that, while effective, were not as adapted as Inuit constructions. They refused to learn from indigenous peoples, perhaps because of cultural prejudice or an inherent stubbornness. Archaeological finds show that even when the climate worsened, the Vikings continued to try to maintain their agricultural practices, while the Inuit simply adapted, moving with the seasons and animals. The story of the Vikings in Greenland is a saga of resilience, yes, but also of a certain cultural arrogance. They were navigators and warriors, but they were not masters of Arctic adaptation. The Inuit, on the other hand, were the real experts, the ones who understood the secrets of survival in one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet. They didn't need ships to connect to the outside world. Their world was the Arctic, and they mastered it with a wisdom that came from generations of experience. So the next time you marvel at the human ability to overcome challenges, remember the Inuit. They did not have modern technology, but they had in-depth knowledge and a perfect adaptation to their environment. They didn't try to change Greenland to suit them. They changed themselves to suit Greenland. And that's why, while the Vikings disappeared, the Inuit continue to thrive in the Arctic to this day, a silent testament to the fact that true strength lies in harmony with nature, not trying to subjugate it. The Viking myth. From conqueror to failed farmer. If your image of a Viking is that of a muscular warrior with a horned helmet, which, by the way, never existed, brandishing an axe and looting villages, get ready for a demystification that can be as shocking as discovering that Santa Claus doesn't exist. For the Vikings in Greenland, reality was a far cry from Hollywood movies and heroic sagas. They were not conquerors but farmers and, let's face it, not very successful at that. The myth of the Viking, so romanticized in our pop culture, crumbles into the ice of Greenland, revealing a story of stubbornness, flawed adaptation, and ultimately, a spectacular agrarian failure. Imagine Eric, the Red, the same one who sold you the green earth. He was not interested in plundering monasteries or conquering kingdoms. He was interested in land, in pastures for his sheep and cows, in a place to restart his life as a farmer, away from the troubles he himself created. The settlers who followed him were not hordes of bloodthirsty warriors, but families of farmers and ranchers, seeking a more stable and prosperous life. The idea of a Viking with a plow in his hand rather than a battle axe may seem strange, but it was the reality in Greenland. The problem was that Greenland refused to be a farm. The soil was poor, the climate was brutal, and the growing season was ridiculously short. They tried, with an almost comical persistence, to replicate the lifestyle they knew from Norway and Iceland. They built barns, tried to grow grain, raised cattle, but nature had other plans. Crops were meager, hay for cattle was scarce, and each winter was a battle to keep the animals alive. It was not the life of a glorious warrior, but that of a dirty, hungry peasant, struggling with cold and hunger. Think of the image we have of the Viking. Strong, fearless, domineering. Now contrast this with the reality of a man who spends his days cutting peat moss to heat his home, scraping sealskins to make clothes, or fishing through holes in the ice to keep from starving. There is no glory in this, only the hard and monotonous routine of survival. The dark humor that permeated their lives was perhaps the only way to deal with the irony of their situation. They, the descendants of the great navigators and marauders, reduced to a precarious subsistence existence. The romanticization of the modern Viking ignores the brutality of everyday life. There was no time for great heroic deeds when every day was a struggle to find food and keep the fire burning. Life was short, difficult, and full of diseases. Hygiene was non-existent, the smell was constant, and privacy was a distant dream. The Viking warrior of Greenland was more likely to die of scurvy or an infection than on a glorious battlefield. And stubbornness? The stubbornness. The Vikings of Greenland clung to their European way of life with a stubbornness that ultimately proved fatal. They had neighbors, the Inuit, who were masters of the art of living in the Arctic. The Inuit knew how to hunt whales and seals efficiently, how to build shelters perfectly adapted to the cold, how to dress for the winter. But the Vikings, for some reason, don't seem to have learned from them. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps cultural prejudice, perhaps just the inability to abandon a way of life that was familiar to them. They preferred to fight against nature rather than adapt to it. The myth of the Viking as a ruthless conqueror is powerful, but Greenland's history shows us a very different side. It shows a people who, despite their resilience and courage, were ultimately defeated not by a human enemy, but by a far more implacable enemy, the climate and its own inability to adapt. They did not go to Valhalla on a cloud of glory. They just disappeared, one by one, into their icy farms. Think about your own life. How often do you cling to an idea or a habit, even when the evidence shows it's not working? The Greenland Vikings are a grim reminder that persistence, without the ability to adapt, can lead to failure. They were, in essence, the first settlers who tried to force an environment to conform to their expectations, rather than conform to their surroundings. So the next time you see a movie or a series about Vikings and their looting and pillaging, remember your brothers and sisters in Greenland. Remember the farmers who fought against ice, hunger, and darkness, and who, in the end, were quietly swallowed up by nature. The myth of the Viking is fascinating, but the reality of Greenland's failed farmer is a much deeper lesson in human resilience, stubbornness, and the ruthless indifference of the natural world. They were not the conquerors we imagined. They were, in fact, the ones conquered, not by swords but by snowflakes, winter boredom, what to do when there's nothing to do. If you've ever found yourself scrolling endlessly through your phone's feed, complaining that you have nothing to watch on your favorite streaming platform, or feeling an existential void because the Wi-Fi went down, get ready for a trip to the past where boredom wasn't a passing inconvenience but an oppressive force, a challenge to your own sanity. For the Vikings in Greenland, the long winter months were not an opportunity to binge-watch series or learn a new language online. They were a test of mental endurance, where the monotony was as relentless as the cold outside. It was winter boredom, and the only thing to do was, well, survive it. Imagine yourself trapped inside a peat house with the wind howling outside and the darkness of the polar night stretching for weeks on end. There is no television, no radio, no books, unless you were a priest with a precious manuscript, and even then, light was scarce. There is no internet, no electronic games, not even a window big enough to observe the outside world. Life contracted into the confined space of his dwelling, and time seemed to drag on like a glacier. So, what was done? Well, the first thing was to work. Even inside the house, there were endless tasks. Seal and reindeer skins needed to be scraped, tanned, and sewn together to make or mend clothing and blankets. The wool of the sheep was spun and woven on rudimentary looms, turning it into tunics and stockings. Tools of bone and wood were carved and repaired. Fishing nets were woven and patched. Each of these jobs was repetitive, time-consuming, and essential for survival. It wasn't a relaxing hobby, it was a necessity, and the monotony of the task was just another aspect of boredom. But what about when the job was done or when the fireplace light was too dim for detailed tasks? This is where the main form of entertainment came in. Orality. The sagas, the legends, the family stories, the myths of the Norse gods. All this was told and retold around the fire. Imagine the old man's voice, deep and monotonous, narrating the adventures of Eric the Red or the exploits of Thor, as the flames danced and the shadows stretched on the peat walls. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were the history, morals, culture, and identity of a people, passed down from generation to generation. It was their Netflix, but without the option to skip the intro. Simple games such as Hanafatafel, a strategic board game, a kind of Viking chess, were played with pieces of bone or stone. Riddles and riddles were exchanged, testing intelligence and memory. Songs were sung, perhaps to the accompaniment of a rudimentary stringed instrument. Social interaction was intense and there was no escaping it. Conversations, gossip, arguments, and inevitably fights were amplified by the constant proximity. There was no option to put on the headphones and isolate yourself. And of course, there was sleep. Too much sleep. The human body, in response to prolonged darkness and food shortages, tends to hibernate. They slept for long hours, perhaps in irregular cycles, taking advantage of the warmth of the fireplace and the proximity of the bodies. Sleep was an escape, a refuge from boredom and cold, a way to save energy in an environment where every calorie was precious. Sensory deprivation was a significant factor. The sounds were limited to the howling of the wind, the crackling of the fire, the murmurs and noises of the house. The smells were the same: smoke, sweat, animals, food. The views were the dark walls and the gloom. The lack of external stimuli must have been overwhelming, leading to a sense of confinement and, for some, a deep melancholy. The mind, without new information to process, could turn inward, ruminating on the difficulties and uncertainty of the future. Today, we live in a world of overstimulation. Our brains are constantly bombarded by information, images, sounds. Boredom is seen as something to be avoided at all costs, a sign of personal failure. For the Vikings, boredom was an inevitable part of life, especially in winter. It was a condition to be endured, not healed. And in some ways, this constant exposure to boredom may have strengthened their resilience, their patience, and their dependence on imagination and human interaction. Think about your own relationship with boredom. Do you hug him or run away from him? The Vikings of Greenland had no choice. They had to learn to live with him, to fill the hours with work, with stories, with the simple presence of each other. There was nothing to do in the sense of modern entertainment, but there was always life to be lived, even if in a monotonous and repetitive way. So the next time you feel bored and reach for your cell phone, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They didn't have the option to swipe up to find something new. They had to create their own world within the peat walls, facing boredom with patience and the strength of their own minds. It was a brutal lesson in the human ability to endure monotony, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest challenge is not fighting a visible enemy, but the absence of anything. The smell of a Viking house, an olfactory experience. If you're the type to invest in scented candles, room diffusers, and air fresheners to keep your home smelling pleasant, get ready for an olfactory trip that would have your nose begging for mercy. For the Vikings in Greenland, The smell of a home was not a matter of personal preference. It was a heady and inescapable symphony of smoke, sweat, animals, and food, a poignant concoction that pervaded every fiber of his existence. It was the smell of survival, and, let's face it, it wasn't for the faint of stomach. Imagine yourself walking into one of these peat houses. The first thing that would hit his nostrils would be the smoke. Not the occasional smoke from a well-ventilated fireplace, but a constant, dense haze of peat smoke. Peat, when burned, produces an earthy, heavy smell with a sulfurous touch, almost like a swamp on fire. This smoke didn't just heat up, it filled the air, stuck to the walls, the ceiling, the clothes, the hair. If you've ever been near a campfire for a long time, you know how the smell of smoke pervades everything. Now, multiply that by months on end, in a poorly ventilated environment. It was the scent of the house, and you took it with you wherever you went. Mixed with the smoke came the human smell. Forget about daily baths, scented soaps, and deodorants. Water was a precious frozen resource, and personal hygiene was a rare luxury. Sweat, the skin's natural sebum, breath, and yes, the inevitable body odors of a population that lived in constant physical effort and ate a diet rich in fat and meat. The enforced proximity inside the peat houses meant that there was no escape from these odors. You breathed in the smell of your neighbors, your family, yourself, 24 hours a day. It was the smell of humanity in its most raw and deodorized form. And then, the animals. The animals. During the long and harsh winters, cattle, sheep, and calves were often housed in or in very close annexes to the main house to protect them from the cold and to take advantage of the body heat they generated. That meant you shared your space with the smell of fresh, dry manure, of wet and dirty wool, of the hot, moist breath of ruminants. It was not a zoo, but the olfactory experience was comparable. The ammonia smell of manure mixed with the earthy smell of peat and the rancid smell of animal fat, creating an additional layer to the olfactory symphony. And the food? The diet was based on meat, fat, and fish. Imagine the smell of seal meat simmering for hours, the strong aroma of dried and salted fish, whale blubber being melted for consumption or for lighting. There wasn't a wide variety of spices or herbs to mask the natural odors of food. The food was cooked over the open fireplace, and its vapors mixed with the smoke and other odors, creating a heavy, lingering aroma that pervaded the walls, the utensils, and the people themselves. It was the smell of nutrition, but also the smell of repetition and monotony. Other, less obvious odors also contributed to this experience. The smell of damp earth and mold from peat walls, the smell of raw hides being scraped and tanned, the smell of urine, used for cleaning and tanning hides, and of course the smell of the buckets of human waste that were kept indoors before being emptied. Each of these elements added a note to the complex and, to us, repulsive fragrance of Viking life. For the Vikings, these smells were not necessarily unpleasant. They were the smells of life, of security, of warmth. The smell of smoke meant heat. The smell of animals meant food and wool. The smell of food meant sustenance. They were used to it, and their noses probably adapted, filtering out what would be unbearable for us. It was the environment in which they were born and raised, and the absence of these smells was perhaps more disturbing than their presence. Today, we spend fortunes to create controlled olfactory environments, to mask natural odors, and to surround ourselves with artificial fragrances. For the Vikings, life was an immersive and undeniable olfactory experience. There was no escape. Each breath was a constant reminder of where they were, what they were doing, and who they were. So the next time you light a scented candle or spray a room deodorizer, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They lived in a world where smell was an intrinsic part of their reality, a heady and smelly mixture that was both the smell of their struggle and the smell of their survival. It was an olfactory experience that reminds us of the brutality and simplicity of its existence, and makes us grateful for our air filters and our running water. The legacy, the ruins that tell stories. If you've ever felt melancholy when you see an abandoned building or an old photo of a place that no longer exists, get ready for a reflection on what remains when a civilization falls apart, not in a dramatic explosion, but in an icy whisper. For the Vikings in Greenland, the legacy was not an enduring empire or great monuments, but rather a handful of stone and peat ruins, silent and desolate, that today tell us a story far more complex and brutal than any heroic saga. They are what's left, and what we can learn from them is a grim reminder of the fragility of human existence. Imagine yourself walking today on the green slopes, in summer of course, of Greenland, where Viking settlements once existed. You won't find grandiose cities, nor imposing castles. What you'll see are grass-covered mounds of earth, which, to an untrained eye, could just be natural formations. But to the archaeologist, these mounds are the crumbling walls of peat houses, barns, stables, and even churches. They are the scars of a civilization that struggled to cling to a land that, in the end, rejected it. The most impressive ruins are those of churches such as the one at Valsey, which still stands defying time and the elements. Built of heavy stones, they are a testament to the faith and determination of these settlers. But even these sturdy structures are empty, their wooden roofs long since rotted, their altars silent. They remind us that even in such a hostile environment, the human need for spirituality and community persisted. But they also remind us that faith, no matter how strong, cannot warm a hungry body or bring a ship when the sea is frozen. Archaeologists, those detectives of the past, are the ones who give voice to these silent ruins. They dig through the middens, those piles of garbage and waste we mentioned, and find treasures of information, animal bones that tell us about the diet, lots of seals, few cows, bone and stone tools that reveal the scarcity of iron, scraps of clothing that show adaptation to the cold. Every fragment, every bone, every piece of pottery is a word in a story that was not written on parchments but on the earth itself. What these ruins tell us above all is a story of adaptation and ultimately of failure to adapt. They show the Vikings' stubbornness in trying to maintain a European lifestyle in an Arctic environment. The peat houses, while effective, were a compromise. Attempts at agriculture, as heroic as they were unsustainable in the long run. The legacy is not one of glory, but of an incessant struggle against an invisible and implacable enemy, the climate. Compare these ruins to the remains of Inuit settlements, which coexisted with the Vikings. Snow igloos, by their nature, do not leave permanent ruins. But their tools, their methods of hunting, their art, all of this demonstrates a harmony with the environment that the Vikings never achieved. The Inuit legacy is one of continuity, of a wisdom passed down through generations, of a people who knew how to read the signs of nature and bow to them, instead of trying to break them. The Viking ruins in Greenland are a grim reminder that human resilience has its limits. They show us that no matter how brave and determined we are, nature can be an invincible adversary. They teach us that stubbornness in maintaining an unsustainable way of life, even in the face of growing evidence of its unviability, can lead to extinction. It was not an invasion, nor a war, nor a sudden plague that swept them away. It was the slow and inexorable tightening of the ice, the failure of crops, the increasing isolation, and the inability to change. Today, when we look at climate change and the environmental challenges we face, the ruins of Greenland serve as a warning. They remind us that history is not just about the past, it's about the lessons we can learn for the future. They invite us to reflect on our own relationship with the planet, on our capacity to adapt, and on the dangers of ignoring the signals that nature sends us. So the next time you see a ruin, whether it's an old farm or an abandoned building, don't just look at rocks and dirt. Look at the stories they tell, the lives that were lived there, the struggles that were fought. The Viking ruins of Greenland are a silent epitaph for a people who refused to give up, but who, in the end, were swallowed by the ice. They are a legacy of stubbornness and tragedy, a reminder that sometimes the greatest lesson of history is that not every saga has a happy ending, and that nature, in its majestic indifference, always has the last word. Human resilience, an ice lesson. If you've ever felt exhausted after a day at work, or discouraged by a minor setback, get ready for a lesson in resilience that would make any self-help guru look like an amateur. For the Vikings in Greenland, life was not a series of challenges to overcome, but a continuous existence of deprivation, cold, and uncertainty. Its ability to endure the unbearable, to persist in the face of the inevitable, is a testament to the incredible and sometimes stubborn strength of the human spirit. It was an icy lesson, written with sweat, blood, and tears, about the limits of persistence. Imagine the daily routine, waking up in the dark, in the cold, with the smell of smoke and animals impregnating their nostrils, going out to collect ice or peat, with the biting wind whipping your face, hunting in an environment where every step was a bet against hypothermia or starvation, returning home to a confined space, with the same people, the same smells, the same concerns, and repeat all this day after day for centuries. There were no vacations, no weekends, no retirement. Life was a constant struggle, and the only reward was the chance to fight again the next day. Their resilience was not a choice, but a necessity. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The sea was treacherous, and the outside world distant and indifferent. They were trapped in their own icy hell, and the only way to survive was to adapt, harden, and find strength in their community and their faith. They didn't have the option to give up. To give up meant to die, and life, as brutal as it was a precious commodity. Think about the ability to adapt. They did not have modern technology, but they used what nature gave them with impressive ingenuity. They built turf houses that were fortresses against the cold. They used seal and reindeer skins to dress themselves, turning them into a second skin. They developed hunting and fishing techniques that allowed them to extract sustenance from an environment they refused to give. Each solution was a testament to his creativity and his determination to survive. But the darkest lesson of Viking resilience in Greenland is that it has its limits. As much as they struggled, as much as they adapted, the climate changed in a way that they could not control or even understand. The Little Ice Age was an invisible enemy that slowly eroded their livelihood bases. The stubbornness in maintaining a lifestyle that was becoming increasingly unsustainable, the refusal to learn from the Inuit, who thrived in the same environment, were factors that, in the end, sealed his fate. Resilience, without the ability to adapt to fundamental change, can become a form of self-destructive stubbornness. They persisted in a model that was failing, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of lack of options, perhaps out of blind faith in their own traditions. And this persistence, which in other circumstances would have been commendable, led them to their end. Today we live in a world of rapid change and complex challenges. The history of the Greenland Vikings is a mirror for us. She asks us, are we resilient enough to face adversity? But it also asks us, are we adaptable enough to change when the world around us demands a new approach? The icy lesson is that resilience alone is not enough. It takes intelligence, flexibility, and the ability to recognize when it's time to abandon old ways and embrace new ones. They didn't have the option to reinvent themselves easily. We have. We have the science to understand climate change, the technology to develop new solutions, and the ability to learn from past mistakes. Human resilience is a powerful force, but it is not unlimited. It needs to be accompanied by wisdom and a will to evolve. Think about your own life. Where are you being stubborn when you should be flexible? Where are you persisting in something that is no longer working? The Vikings of Greenland show us that the line between resilience and self-destruction can be very thin, especially when the environment changes irreversibly. So the next time you feel strong and able to overcome anything, remember the Vikings of Greenland. They were the embodiment of resilience, but even so, they were swallowed by the ice. His story is a grim reminder that nature has the last word, and that true wisdom lies in knowing when to fight and when to bend, when to persist and when to adapt. It's a chilling but essential lesson about the fragility and strength of the human condition. And so, we come to the end of another monotonous but, I hope, instructive journey. The story of the Vikings in Greenland is a reminder that life, even in its most brutal moments, is full of fascinating details, of smells, of sounds, of silent struggles that rarely make it into the history books. They had no central heating, no food delivery, and no option to just give up when the going got tough. They lived and died in a world where every day was a battle, and nature in its majestic indifference always had the last word. Now, as the sound of my voice fades, and the images of peat houses and icy seas begin to dissolve in your mind, feel the warmth of your blanket, the comfort of your pillow, or think of the running water, the light that turns on with a touch, the food that arrives at your table without you having to hunt it in ice. Their life was a constant struggle. Yours, a luxury they could never have imagined. Let this historical monotony envelop you. Let the cold of the past turn into the warmth of your present. Take a deep breath. Feel the weight of your body relaxing in bed. The world outside can wait. For now, just rest. Let the silence of the ice and the darkness of the polar night lull you into a deep, peaceful sleep.